would like to welcome Sabina Russell. Sabina is a principal and co-founder of Zen Clean Energy Solutions, a boutique Vancouver-based consulting firm specializing in hydrogen and fuel cells. She has over 23 years of experience working in the hydrogen sector and leads Zen's project management branch with a focus on consortium-based projects, deploying zero emissions technologies and infrastructure with active projects spanning the full hydrogen value chain. Sabina led Zen's work to develop the hydrogen strategy for Canada and recently contributed to regional hydrogen studies for the Maritimes in British Columbia. Before joining Zen, Sabina was with Ballard Powered Systems for 18 years, developing fuel cell products, and finished her time there as Director of Product Engineering. Please join me in welcoming Sabina Russell. Thank you, Sabina.
Thank you. Thanks so much, Erin. It's very humbling to follow Minister excuse me, Minister O'Regan. So we wanted to set the stage today by talking a little bit more about the hydrogen strategy for Canada and what's happening globally, and just give that quick overview so we can really dive into the topics around ports in Canada. So next slide, please. So as Erin said, the Zen team was really lucky to get to work with NRCan to develop the hydrogen strategy for Canada. I think Minister O'Regan did a great job in explaining that this is really setting the vision for hydrogen in Canada out to the 2050 timeframe. We see it as very strategically important as part of Canada's net zero energy system going forward. So this was released in December of last year, and it's a long document, but I do highly encourage you to take a moment and read the executive summary, and I'll try to cover a few highlights here today. Next slide. So really, what is driving the demand for hydrogen in Canada, but globally as well? And it's this urgent need to decarbonize. And governments around the world are really embracing the need to hit net zero by 2050 in order to mitigate the effects of climate change. And so if you look at Canada's emissions, we're at about 730 million tons of CO2 equivalent per year today. And if you look at what sectors those emissions come from, the big emitters are transportation, oil and gas, heavy industry, and the built environment, especially in Canada with our cold climate. And hydrogen is particularly well suited to tackle those more difficult, hard to abate sectors where direct electrification can be a little bit more challenged. So that's why we need to do it. And the good thing is that we have a lot of unique comparative and competitive advantages compared to other regions. So everything from being very rich in feedstocks to produce low carbon hydrogen. We have a really strong industry sector. We have a strong energy sector that can quickly pivot and to take on the hydrogen mission. We have very important established international relationships, both for technology development, but also for trade. Energy export channels to market, including deep sea ports, which we're talking about today, and a strong head start. So we're one of the top 10 producers of hydrogen today, mostly for oil and gas upgrading. And benefits, obviously it's driven by decarbonization, but clean air in urban centers as we look at zero emission vehicles will be a really important benefit. It does give us in Canada this opportunity for our petroleum sector to pivot and be part of the net zero future. And when we look long term, we need that resilience in our energy system. So we can't rely on just one way of delivering energy through wires. We're going to need chemical and gaseous fuels as well as electricity. And finally, we'll see benefits around economic growth if we really embrace leadership in this sector. Next slide. So the good thing is we're not starting from zero at all. We have great projects going on from coast to coast in Canada. Everything from transportation and light duty vehicles and fueling networks. We have port projects under development and lots of studies, regional studies as well. And of course, even bringing in clean hydrogen for conventional fuels to lower carbon intensity. In Atlantic Canada, which we're talking about today, there were some early pilots, but to be honest, there's room for more projects to be developed. Zen has actually been involved in a recent study for the Maritimes, and now it's been expanded to include Newfoundland and Labrador. And so looking at all of Atlantic Canada, and ports are definitely highlighted there as key opportunities for developing hubs for hydrogen. Next slide. So when you look at production pathways, as I said, Canada is really well positioned in a number of the key pathways. So we can produce hydrogen using renewable electricity and the electrolysis pathway. We have a very abundant fossil fuel reserves, but it's going to be very, very important that going forward, we capture and sequester the carbon. So our strategy federally is to develop all low carbon pathways and really focus on our core mission, which is decarbonization at the lowest cost, fastest path possible. So we're one of the top 10 producers of hydrogen today, and the strategy sets a vision, if you just tab down, to be one of the top 3 producers globally in the world for low carbon intensity hydrogen. Next slide. And again. So that was about production of hydrogen. Where are we going to use hydrogen? People break it up differently, but we look at it as we can use it directly as a fuel in zero emission vehicles, but also in co-combustion vehicles for transport. We can use it to produce power, so low carbon power through fuel cells or hydrogen turbines. You can burn hydrogen and use it to produce heat for industry and buildings. And of course, a feedstock for many chemical processes, oil and gas upgrading, ammonia production, steel making. So lots of different uses for hydrogen, really highlighting its versatility. Next slide. So if you look at Canada today and how our energy is delivered, you can see a lot of it is still delivered in the form of refined petroleum product or natural gas. So it's, when we have distributed combustion emissions, that's the challenge we face to get to net zero. And when we look at a net zero scenario, if you could just tab down, please. And again. So when we look at net zero, really the path there is, first of all, we have to decarbonize our electricity grids as much as possible, because actually when you look at primary energy in Canada, about 80% of it's fossil fuel derived today, including generation for our electricity grids. So we got to clean those up. We have to directly electrify as much as we can, eliminate distributed combustion emissions wherever we can, develop biofuels, and of course, introduce hydrogen at scale. And when we say introduce it at scale, of the roughly 9,400 petajoules of energy delivered in our country, we see hydrogen playing a role of up to 30% of that by 2050. And that could reduce our current emissions by about 25%. So the opportunity is truly significant. Next slide. So the strategy lays out hubs, this idea of hubs as being a really important element to get the sector off the ground. And when we talk about a hub, what we're talking about, if you look over on the right-hand side, it's really developing the whole value chain from production to distribution to the fueling infrastructure to deliver the hydrogen to end use, all at scale in a concentrated geographical region. And so Canada, and a good ambitious target is to have 30 hubs in Canada by 2030. And the good thing is we've already started. We're seeing hubs organically forming. We have champions that are saying, hey, we want to be a host for these hubs, and then industry and partnerships are being formed to deliver these projects. So they're starting, and longer term, what we see is the hubs will eventually grow and expand, and new ones will form and be connected by infrastructure. Next slide. And so then looking at globally, because it's important that our hubs connect to the rest of the world, this is a lot of detail on here. All I'm going to say is the colors on the map show different regions, whether they're producing or if they're red, they're going to definitely be importing when it comes to hydrogen. They're already releasing import strategies. So there's going to be international connections for the flow of hydrogen. And so, when looking at blue, you can see opportunities to move hydrogen from region to region, from Canada on the West Coast. We see opportunities to export down to California and to Asia. And then on the East Coast, Europe is a great opportunity. And we're so excited to have Monica Swanson from the Port of Rotterdam here to tell us more about their import strategy and how we can connect. What's very exciting, if you look at black, we've tried to list some of the really, really big projects that have been announced, especially those that tie into ports. And globally today, there's over 230 massive projects announced. And we're talking about the really big ones, not the small demos, that represent about 300 billion investment when it comes to hydrogen projects. And a lot of those are being developed at port regions for export of hydrogen. Next slide. So longer term, I just want to kind of lay out a vision for infrastructure for hydrogen in Canada. We think pipelines are going to be a really important part of the picture, and Canada is very good at developing pipelines. And we think our ports and ability to ship internationally will be very important as well. Next slide. So the strategy does identify ports as being a great opportunity for developing these hubs in Canada. And I just wanted to share, why do we think that they're strategically positioned. For one thing, ports tend to have multi-modes of operation coming, or of transportation coming in and out of them. So they often have a rail element, they'll have tugboats, they'll have material handling equipment. So lots of end uses that can leverage common infrastructure. And because of all the heavy duty equipment that's there, they also have emissions challenges. So high point sources of emissions for both greenhouse gases, but also local air pollutants that impact health and air quality. A lot of ports are heavily reliant on diesel for this equipment. And some of that diesel equipment is more challenging for battery deployments because they just don't have the energy density needed to do the job. I already mentioned we can share common infrastructure. I think another key piece is our federal government has a lot of influence over the ports and can help by adopting hydrogen as end users themselves. And we can learn a lot from what other ports around the world are doing. So we're seeing big hydrogen projects at Port of LA, in Australia, New Zealand, in Europe, and Canada can really, we're not the first leader here. We can be a fast follower and learn from what those other ports have been doing. Next slide. I think Minister O'Regan talked about shipping, and obviously that's a really important tie-in with our ports. A lot of people, when we think about hydrogen in the marine sector, we think it's got to be pure hydrogen used in a fuel cell engine. Just want to point out that there's a lot of different pathways that are evolving, all with a focus on reducing emissions and decarbonizing. So ammonia can be a good transitional fuel. It can actually be combusted in retrofit engines. It can also be used to move hydrogen in a very dense way. We're seeing liquid synthetic fuels and some real Canadian innovation leadership in this area, where we make a liquid fuel using renewable hydrogen with captured CO2 from the environment, and then methanol is another pathway. So we'll talk more about this in the breakout section. And I just wanted to end with a couple slides, next slide, on some specific opportunities in Atlantic Canada. So Zen was working on the Atlantic Canada hydrogen study recently, and two ports that I'm going to highlight, it doesn't mean they're the only ones because we saw opportunities for others as well. But when we look at Port of St. John in New Brunswick, we had a lot of really interesting discussions there with the port and the operator, and we're going to hear from some of them today. But you know, there's a lot of reasons why this port could be a great hub in the Maritime provinces. Multi-mode of operation there. It's also very close to the Irving oil refinery, which is just kind of interesting because Irving Oil has actually started to lower the carbon intensity of their hydrogen use for upgrading by capturing and using CO2. So long term, as we expand, we can see a real tie-in with common infrastructure there. And next slide. When we were doing the study for Newfoundland and Labrador, we had a lot of interesting discussions with Port of Argentia. Again, that can be a great hub, quite a different play there in that it's a more remote port, but there's a lot of focus on developing renewables in the region, especially with wind, so that wind to hydrogen pathway could make a lot of sense. And also it's a ferry terminal for the Marine Atlantic Ferry. And so that could be a large user, a large single user of hydrogen to really get that scale going. And so some interesting discussions going on there for APUs or auxiliary power units using hydrogen on board the vessel to reduce emissions. So we see great opportunities in Atlantic Canada, and I'm really looking forward to the discussion today to help develop those. Thanks very much. Oh, sorry, I had one more slide. Okay, sorry, I'll just end with this. This is the vision for hydrogen in Canada in 2050. So, you know, I think we've already talked about a lot of this, but when Canada looks at where we want to be a top 3 producer of low carbon intensity. We want to have millions of fuel cell vehicles deployed across Canada. The scale we've talked about, 30% of delivered energy, that's about 20 million tons of hydrogen a year. And that's domestic use. And we've also estimated export could be about the same amount. I mentioned pipelines are going to be an important way to move hydrogen around. And when you look at all of this together, the economics that can be really developed in Canada around this sector are truly amazing. We estimate a value of $50 billion by 2050 for our domestic market alone, and more than double that when we take into account exports. And with that comes jobs, 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 and particularly in Atlantic Canada, that's very, very important. And so we really see great opportunities there. And the roadmap lays out 8 key pillars where we have actions in the strategy to really drive change. And ports and hubs really cover a lot of these different elements. So thank you very much.